Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Global Encounters seminar series. My name is Lynette Russell and I am the director of the Global Encounters program. And tonight we've got a real thrill. Right now I'm talking to you from the unceded lands of Naarm, also known as Melbourne, the land of the Kulin Nations. But tonight we're going to have Associate Professor Wendy van Duivenvoorde, and she's going to talk to us about pre-cook visits to Australia. And then after that, Dr. Lee Penman's going to do a response, and then we'll open up to questions and conversation. So thank you all for joining us. I will now stop sharing, and this will give Wendy the chance to share her screen.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Great.
I'm going to set this up for a second. Here we go. I hope you can all see my beginning slide now, my first slide. There we go. So yeah, let's get started. Can everyone see that one? Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
I can't see it myself because I've lost the Zoom environment. I'm just looking at the presentation now. So, here we go. So thanks everyone, and thank you in particular to Lynette for inviting me, and for Leonie for being such a wonderful logistical host in the background and organizing everything. So in the coming 20 minutes or half an hour, I will just basically detail mainly the importance of the 1705 Maarten van Delft expedition for the early European history and cultural contact with Northern Australia. It will be a little bit of a descriptive presentation, and I apologize for that. But it will mainly be a bit of storytelling, and then I'll discuss also what we have planned for the future, because what we've done so far in this particular project has mainly been historic, and it's been the beginning of a larger project, not only surrounding the 1705 expedition, but mainly our archaeological study into the Tiwi Islands. So the expedition of Van Delft sailed from Batavia with 3 ships under the command of Maarten van Delft from Middelburg. And they spent about 3.5 months exploring the north coast of Australia. Along the way, they interacted with different groups of indigenous people and possibly collected cultural material that's now held in the Dutch National Museum of World Cultures in Leiden. And to date, that's the earliest known existing cultural material collected from Australia that we know is somewhere. We can relocate that. We, of course, have historic references to much earlier material that was collected on the Western Australian coast, all the way back to about 1636, and in Northern Australia, 1623. But we don't know where that material is. So through the detailed analysis of primary sources for this expedition, including the cartography, we've kind of demonstrated that the expedition covered parts of the Australian mainland, Croker Island, Melville Island, and Bathurst Island in the Tiwi. Of course, we know of brief and often intense interactions with indigenous people that occurred from the first time the Dutch East India Company ships ventured into Australian waters in 1606. The Duiven expedition, for example, when they sailed into Northern Australian waters along Cape York, they had a very brief encounter between crew and indigenous people. And they lost one crew member that was fatally wounded by a spear. A few years later, same region, we know that Jan Carstensen, from which we have the earliest surviving copy journal from the Dutch East India Company archives that describes the Australian coast, also had a very brief interaction. But these interactions are quite brief and often not only short, but also violent. And that goes both ways, of course. I listed here, this is a table from Michael Pearson's book that lists all these timelines of explorations and survey of the Australian coastline. The 1606 Willem Janszoon is listed there. And of course, there have been there anecdotal references to earlier encounters, but we just don't have the historic sources for that or data. I put Dirk Hartog in here because in 1616 he set his foot, not him, but a few of his crew members on the northern end of Shark Bay, or Dirk Hartog Island in Shark Bay, where they left, of course, the earliest archaeological material in Australia by Europeans. And of course, that is material that was collected and brought back to Europe that we still have in a museum, in the National Museum in Amsterdam. It's just not indigenous material. And then, of course, there's the Dutch shipwrecks. We have detailed historic references through, and there's the plate with the transcription over it. Most of the material from those Dutch shipwrecks are, of course, housed in the shipwreck galleries in Fremantle at the WA Museum. And they're probably the most extensively studied episodes of the Dutch in Australia. And through those shipwrecking events and the historic sources that we have from those encounters, we not only get descriptions of the Australian coastline, but we also learn that there was probably very, very little interaction or no interaction with Indigenous Australians. Of course, in 1629, we have the Batavian shipwrecking off the Western Australian coast, which is probably the best known of the 4 Dutch ships that went down in the 17th and 18th centuries. About 10 days after the shipwrecking, on the 14th of June, 1629, the chief merchant, Pelsart, observes people on the mainland as they're sailing by, which is probably the first observation of Indigenous people along the west coast of Australia. But we have no evidence for any interaction. The same can be said for example, the Zeewick, for almost 100 years later in 1727, where the surviving crew lived for about 10 months on the Houtman-Abrolhos archipelago, or the southern group of islands there. But in the 18th century, those were not, there were no Indigenous people on those islands. And so there was no interaction of any shape or form. With the Gilt Dragon, or the Vergulde Draak, in 1656, which sank north of Perth, along the Western Australian mainland. We know survivors, 68 survivors went on land, another 7 managed to sail back to Batavia. And from that, we also have no evidence, certainly no archaeological evidence, but also nothing pertaining in historic records or letters that may allude to any interaction with Indigenous Australians. And of course, Zoutdorp, 1712, that ship completely vanished. We have no records from survivors from that site. We have extensive archaeological work that has been undertaken over the last decades in that area. Well, not so much in the last 20 years, but certainly in the 1980s and 90s. And there too, we have no archaeological evidence that there were any interaction between survivors or Indigenous Australians. There was, of course, on top of the cliffs there, a lot of wreck material has remained in terms of timber and glass, rigging material and so on. But none of that glass, for example, has been found in any worked form. And the shell middens that are found in the area of the shipwreck sites, they predate the shipwreck site by about 3,500 years. We know that that area of that site is very inaccessible. The waters are, and the closest by fresh drinking water is a good 8 kilometers away. So it is thought that, to date at least, that there was very little interaction or no interaction between the shipwreck site, and I'm not even talking about survivors, and the indigenous people who lived on the lands there. Of course, maybe one day in the future, if a good burn goes through that area, and a substantial survey can be done to investigate that a little bit better too. So that brings us to the Van Delft expedition in 1705. That particular expedition was an immediate reaction to William Dampier's exploration of the West Coast in 1688 and 1699. He published his explorations along the Australian coast, and he also had, of course, an interest in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And the Dutch East India Company saw that as a major threat. So from the instructions that were drafted up, of which you can see a page here, in January 1705, that was handed to the Van Delft expedition. Those instructions basically start with the sentence, "The fossicking, spying, and writing of the well-known English traveler William Dampier, as well as other considerations, motivated us to undertake another crusade." So it was a direct response to that. The Dutch East India Company in Batavia sent out 2 expeditions, one under Van Delft to explore the north coast of Australia, and the other one under the direction of Jacob Weiland to explore the New Guinea coast. And the idea was that both expeditions would come together 7 months later on the Banda Islands and explore these regions very well, describe them, make contact with the indigenous peoples living there, and just do a good exploration and mapping of the 2 areas. The Dutch East India Company, of course, wanted to know if that, if there was anything that they would miss out on if the English would attempt to explore that area and plant a flag on those regions first. So it was basically an investigation to see whether they may profit from those 2 regions. Now, the Van Delft expedition is important for 4 reasons. So one of them is Dutch, Indonesian, Indigenous, Australian culture contact. The other one is the detailed charting of a small area of the Northern Territory coast. The collection of the indigenous material culture that I already mentioned earlier. And the other thing that I personally find interesting and like to explore more is the fact that 1/3 of the ship's crew was Indonesian or Asian. So not just European. The Van Delft expedition is quite often overlooked, but it's quite emblematic for the encounters between these 3 culture groups. And I think it should be included in any study of the early history of culture contact in Australia. So here are 3 ships, and they have nothing to do with the Van Delft expedition. I just wanted to show them to you because there are similar types of ships that the Van Delft fleet sailed with. It set sail with 3 vessels, the Vossenbos, which was a flute that was built in Hoorn, only 95 tons in 1693, sailed to Asia once and stayed there until it was laid up in about 1706 or 1707, so quite quickly after the Van Delft expedition. On the left-hand side, you see a flute ship, but this is a large one, probably 4 or 5 times the size of the one that Van Delft took to Northern Australia. What I also found interesting from the archives is that the Vossenbos was really built or could take on a crew of 25 and not many more. And yet, for the Van Delft expedition, it was fitted, or it had a crew of 62. So that's a substantially large number. The other two vessels was the chaloupe wire, which is quite similar to the vessel on the top right, quite small. It only had a crew of 21, probably could more manage, like size-wise, a crew of about 5 or 6. So they certainly put a lot more crew on these vessels than the ships could hold. And the smallest one of the fleet was a panchelang, which is an Indonesian vessel with a sail on it that the Dutch East India Company used in shallow waters quite often, which also had a crew of 21. So both the 3 ships were fitted out to with food and drink. The Fosse was for 10 months, the sloop for 7, and the small panchelang for 2. And then the idea was that the 2 smaller vessels would be supplied by the larger vessel if they would run out of provisions. Of course, they were supposed to stay away for about 7 months, but in reality, they were only, the expedition only lasted for 3.5 months because of sickness. Okay. We know of this expedition because we have a number of archival documents that remain in the Dutch East India Company archives in The Hague. The most important thing maybe is the detailed chart of the North Australian coast that shows the sailing route of the Van Delft expedition. Of course, the sailing instructions have completely survived, as well as extracts of letters that were sent from VOC officials in and around Indonesia to the authorities in Batavia, as well as a report of the expedition that was written up by one of the VOC counselors who used the journals kept on board the 3 vessels, as well as oral accounts of the surviving officers. And unfortunately, we don't have the original journals remaining, at least not in The Hague. Maybe they're somewhere in the Jakarta archive. There's something still so much to explore in that archive in terms of journals that may be hiding out there if they haven't been lost. They also note that the expedition, that there are also a number of declarations and resolutions and other type of papers that detail the loss of anchors along the way, barrels, sails, and some information on sailing directions and so on. Everything that I'm showing you here or discuss, I'll give you a link to where you can find that information and where you can access the archives directly, because all of this material is of course online nowadays. And within, I think, another 6 months, the National Archives in The Hague will release an app that will allow you to make your own transcriptions. And it's not, I've played around with it now for 1.5 years. It works wonderful. Of course, there are still a lot of glitches, but it will really help a lot of researchers around the world with extracting transcriptions from those type of documents themselves. And then, I don't know, if you don't speak Dutch, throw them through Google Scholar and see what you get, right? But that will be a bit of a game changer. So this is the chart that has remained. It shows that the fleet, they left Batavia at the end of January 1705, went to Timor, were supposed to sail away from Timor in March. Weather kept them between January and March, and then, yeah, the 2nd of March, they finally managed to set sail from Timor. It took them a month to get to the Australian coast, and they arrived in Bathurst Island in early April. And then they basically charted the coast, as you can see here. Bathurst, Melville, and as I already said, Cockburn Peninsula and Croker Island. Now, there are transcriptions and translations of some of the documents from the Van Delft expedition, and they're quite accessible for the English reader in Roberts's Dutch Explorations. In terms of the chart, Jan Tent at ANU just published a beautiful article that discusses the map, and that goes over the place names in the map, on the map, but also the place names that are mentioned in the report that was written up for the Van Delft expedition and compares the two. And then, of course, Eric van Broo, professor in Nijmegen anthropology, has written a number of articles. He specialized in Tiwi culture, but he's also published 2 articles that refer to the Van Delft expedition, and they're quite, they're the first go-to. They talk about the people and how he interpreted the Van Delft expedition historic records. So here you can zoom in, here you see a zoom in of the chart. As I already said, from the 2nd of April until the 12th of July, the expedition sailed along the coast and they explored. They were specifically instructed not to go deep into the river systems and just take note of them. And I think because of that, they missed the Apsley Strait, they missed Dundas Strait as corridors. And they still hadn't switched on that they were exploring islands, or the Tiwi Islands rather. Whereas if they would have gone through there and would have explored around the islands, they would have figured out that they were not on the mainland. And the idea was that after their exploration, the Dutch East India Company may go back to this area to explore those inland waterways deeper. I think they were quite afraid to lose ships and crews if they would have done that. They did take substantial note of beaches, peoples, trees, and so on. Again, they described indigenous groups. And I must say the report itself that was left with the, or that was created by the Dutch East India Company is quite negative. But I think that has more to do with the political aspirations of the Dutch East India Company than it was something they found in the journal by Van Delft, for example. The expedition was cut short. They had to leave after 3.5 months as a result of sickness and death among the crew. There were, from already when they left Timor, there was eye infections, high fever, there was hydropsy. There was certainly a virus going around among the 3 ships, and a lot of the crew died. And by the time they were exploring around Croker Island, they basically were at the stage that they had too few men able to sail the vessels, and they had to go back. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come back. And so they left. And then the Wire, the sloop, arrived at Boro at the end of July. New Hollandia or Nova Hollandia made it to Banda also at the end of July. And Vossenbos, the larger fleet ship, arrived in Makassar on the 4th of August, 1705. And of its 62 crew, only 40 were still alive. And of those 40, 25 were violently ill, among whom Van Delft himself, who passed away a few days after arrival. And that ship arrived in Makassar with basically only 4 crew that were able to handle the ship, that were able and not sick. So, of course, they undertook this particular voyage with this 17th century chart of the East Indies and Northern Australia in hand. And this is a compilation made through a number of voyages, whether that's the Tasman voyage in 1644 or the Willem de Vlaming voyage in 1797 of the west coast of Australia. And we also see the east coast, of course, of Indonesia here, which was mapped by Dortsman in the 1640s. And so all these expeditions that had taken place prior to the Van Delft expedition led to the creation of this map. And this map is certainly one that they would have been aware of. They would have had the Tasman map. And of course, this is the beautiful example that's in the State Library of New South Wales. That had indications of anchorages or water places where they would have been able to access fresh water and so on. We know that the other chart, this one, was based, or the north coast of Australia was based on this one, because if you look at the Karst Lake or Shark Bay, you can see this, what do you call it? It's like a butterfly in that, near that anchorage, and that comes back here, but the route of the Tasman journey is taken away. So here is a southwesterly view of Shark Bay, or what's now known Karst Lake, known as Cape Lavery, which is believed to be the landing site of the Van Delft expedition when they arrived here in April and interacted with a group of 14 to 15 men here. It says in the report that the inhabitants didn't withdraw, and they basically ran towards the Dutch or the European guys and tried to drive them off the land. And that created a little bit of tension, and then that was dissipated. And then they stayed here for a few days or some time. They were allowed to access water. There was exchange of fish and other food goods, as well as other things. And it may have been that in these type of encounters along this coast that they would have collected cultural material. So that may have given like a two-way exchange. They describe the people here in the report, how they look, how the women look, that they describe physique, what they ate. And of course they missed a lot of things because they weren't there long enough, but it's a lot more that we have from this expedition than any others. Here we can see a well, which is referred to as the Dutch well, but it probably was there a lot earlier than that. It would have been used by the indigenous people that live on this particular peninsula much and much longer. So that's in Shark Bay. The Van Delft expedition missed the Apsley Strait, as I already mentioned, but they did observe people there. They sail, after they leave Shark Bay, they also miss Snake Bay, and then they sail to the Dundas Strait, where they arrive somewhere at the end of May. And then they cross over to the Cockburn Peninsula. They observe people there around the 14th of June. About 500 people are sitting in the evening around fires and so on. And then again, they describe other areas more closer to the Croker Island, where the crew is so involved with fishing and trying to maintain those that are sick that they don't really interact with indigenous people. But the indigenous people there, they do come and help them with carrying water and fish and other things, which I find quite interesting, because I don't think I would be wanting to hang around sick people if there's such a nasty virus going around. Now, when you overlay the chart of the Van Delft expedition and geo-rectify it, you can see very well that we have the Australian mainland here in Croker Island. In earlier articles, there was some discussion about where they made landfall and spent time. But here it really makes it very clear that the Cockburn Peninsula was an area where they sailed and explored. And they would have continued if there wouldn't have been so much sickness. So we know that they encountered people in different areas. And we can mainly connect them towards the Iwaji people in Port Essington and on the Cockburn Peninsula, and the Walarankua people on the Tiwi, on Melville Island. Okay. what was interesting is that the Dutch East India Company report suggests that Andries Rosenboom, of course, because he was a survivor, Maarten van Delft died, so he really was instrumental in assisting with the writing of the report. And in the report, it suggested he contemplated kidnapping Indigenous people, and that he wouldn't have had any problem with that. So we easily could have taken 2 or 3 men who daily came on board and bring them to Batavia. But the skipper of the Vossenbos, so van Delft, who specifically following the letter of instruction, wished to accomplish such with full consent of those people and not with any kind of force, and has prevented him, Rosenboom, from doing so. Van Delft and the crew couldn't get people to trust them or couldn't convince Indigenous people to come on board and to sail away with them to Indonesia. And I really can't blame them because, as I already said, there was a lot of disease on those ships. There would have been a lot of sick men under the decks. And it's not a very inviting thing to do anyway. And that would have really, I'm sure, would have really put Indigenous people off by making that step. The Dutch East India Company had switched on in the mid-17th century and onwards. They recognized that the kidnapping of people was really not an effective measure in the long run, and that it was much better for diplomatic relation if they would come on their own accord. And that's why the instructions of the Van Delft expedition said it'd be good if they could bring people back from those areas, but they had to come in their own free will. And we know that Indigenous people then would learn Javanese and Dutch, and they would become really valuable interpreters for new expedition. And they also, of course, provide the Dutch East India Company with a lot of intelligence about their own people, customs, and their hinterlands. And what's also interesting in this is that the Van Delft expedition opted to follow the instruction and not kidnap people. But the other expedition that went to New Guinea, they absolutely kidnapped quite a number of people, 2 or 3 women and about 6 men, even though that went against their instruction as well. The women were set free upon arrival in Batavia. I think 2 of the men escaped, and the others were basically employed by the Dutch East India Company to learn Javanese and Dutch. So here are the throwing sticks and clubs that are in the collection of the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands. This is part of a Tiwi collection that was kept by the Dutch East India Company in Batavia, together with cultural material from other company expeditions, not to Australia, but just in general to different areas of Southeast Asia. And when the Dutch East India Company bankrupted in 1795, that material was eventually accessioned in the Royal Batavian Society of Arts and Sciences and brought back to the Netherlands. And for these 4 items, that archival research can be traced back quite well. There are about 16 other items in this collection that may be part of the same collection coming from the Van Delft expedition as well, but that research is still being undertaken. So our research partner, who is the curator of this collection in the Leiden Museum, is working on that particular archival research to trace those collection items back and see whether they exactly came from. And so that's Fanny 105. It should also be recognized that this culture contact was not only between Europeans and Indigenous Australians. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch East India Company was well aware of the knowledge that Southeast Asians had of the Australian coast and coastal waters. And this is part of a beautiful journal and reports that were written by Adriaan Dortsman, who in 1644 and 1645 explored the East and Southeast Indonesian archipelago. As you can see, this script is very legible. Anyone can read this. You don't really have to be trained in 17th century Dutch handwriting. And in his journals, he at some point got stationed in what the Dutch call Timor-Laut, or the Tanimbar Islands, and he operated there for quite a while. The Dutch had all sorts of exclusive trade contracts with not only Timor-Laut or the Tanimbar Islands, but also Kei Islands and Aru after the 1640s. And he oversaw much of that. So in his report, he says, as is done similarly without interference by Macassans and other Westerners, it is certain that they, and he refers here to the inhabitants of the islands southeast of Banda, so those 3 islands group that I just mentioned, they leave no island unvisited, which has been confirmed by their navigation as far as Arau. And also in some degree, it's credible that they often visited the largest southern islands, which has been called after your worship's names, Van Diemenland. And so he refers to Australia here. And of course, the Tanimbar Islands or Kei Islands and Aru Islands, they are maritime people that were well known for pearling, later on trepanging, and other maritime industries. They were well known for their boat building, so that's very much possible. And these are, again, this is that chart, that 17th century chart, that not only shows the result of that 1644 Tasman expedition along the northwest coast of Australia, but also the islands that Dortmund explored around the same time. Here you see a table that's in the instructions for the Van Delft expedition, as well as the Papua New Guinea expedition of 1705. And it lists the crew. And in the first column, or the first 2 columns, it says Europeans, and then it says normal seamen 60 for the 40 for the Vossenbos, and 40 or and 2 soldiers, and then it says Easterners. So it says 5 Eastern or 6 Easterners, and then 15 in the next column. The first column are Mardekkers, and the second column are Indonesians or islanders or local inhabitants of the Indonesian. Mardekkers were a mixed ethnic community of freed slaves in the Dutch trading post. A lot of them came from Bengal and the Malabar regions, but some of them also came from Indonesian or Portuguese areas in Southeast Asia that the Dutch had overrun. And then, of course, the Dutch converted them to Christianity and then granted them manumission. And of course, that gave them a very loyal group that bolstered the Dutch East India Company based in Southeast Asia. The instructions also say that the 2 soldiers, as well as the Mardekkers that are on the Vossenbos, for example, had to be trained in handling pistols and guns, just in case they needed that on the way. And then same here for the Wire and the New Holland. So there's 7 Indonesians with a total crew of 21. So the total crew of the whole fleet was 104 men, and 34 of those were Indonesian. So that's a substantial amount of local Indonesians on board those vessels. We know very little of the crew of the Van Delft expedition. We have only about 5 or 6 names at the moment, and we hope that further research not only will provide social histories for the 5 or 6 that we have names for, like Van Delft. We know he comes from Middelburg. We know very little else about him to date. The 2 captains of the other vessels, the Wire and the Nova Hollandia, they were Germans from Hamburg. And then there are 3 or 4 other names floating around. But we really want to do more research into the makeup of this crew. And again, looking at the social history. So that's something that we have planned for the next few years and that we're still working on with the Dutch archive at the moment. This research was mainly historic and was supported by the Netherlands Embassy under a project that they funded in 2017 called First Dutch Culture Contact with Indigenous Australian at the Tiwi Island. Of course, it was not just the Tiwi Islands, but we didn't know that at the time. Now it's part of an ARC discovery grant before Cook, Contact Negotiation and Archaeology of the Tiwi Islands. That's a much broader project, but this is certainly a small part of that project. And even though the main historic research has finished for that, again, we still have to go into the Jakarta archives to see if we can find more. We have to look into the crew a little bit better. We're still looking at the collection and doing the background research on that. But what we hope to do, and what we actually hope to do this year, and haven't done that yet, is investigate those areas and do geophysics surveys around Kars Lake or the areas where the Dutch set foot on land. They've mapped quite well and described quite well where freshwater sources were. So we'd like to do some hydrology work on those wells. And of course, we know that there were so many crew members who would have passed away or would have died of sickness on the way. Where did these guys go? They wouldn't have been given a burial at sea, so to speak. They're probably buried on islands in and around the Tiwi Islands, north of there, or Coburn Island. So that's something we may investigate in the future as well. So yeah, there's still a lot more to be done there. I just want to thank the National Archive, of course. They've helped us quite a bit with this research and getting the right documents out, as well as the National Museum of World Cultures. And a lot of this research was instigated or started by Daryl Wesley, who also is the lead CI of the ARC Discovery Grant. And he's actually the one who said 2 years ago or 3 years ago, what do you know about the Van Delft expedition? Have you ever looked into that? I'm like, yeah, I've heard about that, but I've just been focusing on what's happening in Western Australia so much and the Dutch shipwrecks there, that it was actually quite good to start looking at other instances where we see the Dutch explore areas in Australia where they actually set foot on land and then also interacted with local Indigenous groups. Now, everything I've said can be found in this article, which was published in 2019, but only has been accessible for a month or two via Informat because they had substantial delays with getting the PDFs out, but it can be downloaded from here, as well as from academia if you have no institutional access. Okay. So yeah, that's it. And apologize for being a little bit descriptive, but there will be more to come outside of the historic narrative.
Thank you, Wendy. That was terrific, really fascinating. I'm going to hand over to Lee, who's going to say a few words. I might get you to stop.
Yeah,
sharing.
I'm trying to look for it. Sorry.
It looks very nice, and from lockdown Melbourne, it's really quite depressing to see such a lovely site.
Where is it? Sorry about that.
It's usually at the top.
Yeah, I only see everyone's here, which is great. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's that glimpse of freedom there
Yes.
with the open ocean. It's irresistible. It's just irresistible. Thank you, Wendy, for your talk, which it's a really fascinating area, and it's encouraging and inspirational to know that it's going to be taken further as well. And that's kind of what I was thinking about as I was listening to your paper. And indeed, you know, your final anecdote there about almost the offhand way in which you came to investigate the Van Delft expedition as well. That kind of got me thinking. I've prepared a couple of comments, and I'll interject some more as well. But I want to put this in a broader perspective by kind of addressing this idea of the unknownness of the Van Delft expedition. And I want to start with Peter Fitzsimmons, he of the piratical headgear, who in his 2011 book on the Batavia opined, you know, why isn't this story better known? It's one of the major events in Australia's history. And this question was answered in a review to Fitzsimmons' book, and the reviewer said fairly flatly that the Batavia shipwreck is not part of Australia's history. It is rather a footnote to Dutch colonial history, the history of another country. And with that, it seems that the question was answered about why isn't this stuff more well known? But I think that this response kind of begs a question of, firstly, what consists of Australian history. But at a deeper level, it provides a challenge to historians, archaeologists, and others who are working on these early contacts. And that's namely, how can they make the stories that they recover, that they uncover, and make them relevant to a broader public interested in Australia's past, you know, to go beyond that kind of pre-Cook sort of placeholder narrative that's kind of is there. And I was also thinking about the fact that, you know, in connection with this, in popular books on Dutch encounters with Australia, it's often stated that the area of research is new, that little is known about it. And yet during your talk, you've pointed out the fact that, you know, kind of the opposite is the truth. The major archival sources are well known. They've been studied since the 19th century, and most have been translated, and nearly all of them are available on the web, albeit incompletely. So for me, the main problem, it doesn't seem to be evidence in this kind of quandary that we're facing, but maybe the problem is in the gap between what the archival evidence says and what we want it to say. And I wonder if this is why that so many popular accounts of the Dutch in Australia invoke supernatural imagery of ghosts and haunting in order to describe them. And I'm thinking of the islands of angry ghosts, Malcolm Uren's Sailorman's ghosts, or even Rupert Gerritson's, and their ghosts may be heard. You know, we want this evidence, we want these encounters to provide insights into the interactions between Dutch and Indigenous communities, and we want them, we wanted to tell rich stories of conflict, but also of cooperation. And we want these stories to be important too, you know, and because they are. So today, I think, Wendy, with this presentation of your research on Van Delft, that you've shown us a way that we can bridge the gap between expectation and evidence, if that is indeed the problem. And that's by supplementing the archival record with other knowledges, Indigenous, archaeological, cartographical, anthropological. You even used a word that I've never heard of before with geophysical.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's above my head. But yeah, you know, this is a kind of thing that can supplement that archival record. And the encounters of Van Delft and the Tiwi and others, I think, is kind of like, this is a really exemplary kind of case study. It's I think, you know, you've documented here and told us all about this major moment in Australia's history, almost for the first time, you know, in this kind of inclusive sense and interdisciplinary sense. And I just, you know, as a historian, I start to think now, you know, have we not thought hard enough about, you know, where other evidence might exist. Yeah, you know, I wonder, for example, about the Wick Man, who was taken back to Ambon by Carstensen in 1623,
Yeah.
or the VOC asking Willem de Fleming to inquire after Australian slaves at the Cape who might be able to assist with his explorations in the 1690s. You know, there seem to me to be stories here, whether there is any evidence there to kind of explicate them or take them further. You know, these anecdotes come out of a world, as you've kind of shown with Van Delft. And yeah, I think this work really offers us, your work and of that of your collaborators offers some new perspectives on old problems. It kind of clothes these Dutch ghosts in some flesh and blood, and it makes the roles that they played in building relationships between Australians, Europeans, but also Indonesians now, as and other Asian peoples, more tangible and much more significant. And so, yeah, I think this kind of really provides a platform in thinking in a new way about a shared Australian past that has Indigenous experiences at its core, but by thinking about it as something other than footnotes to the history of another country, and, you know, part of the stories of more than one people. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That was terrific. I don't know, Wendy, if you wanted to make a quick response, but I'm keen also to get onto the questions. So
yeah, that's all right.
Okay. Well, the one thing I guess I would say is it certainly makes our big interdisciplinary project very exciting, because I think there's so much opportunity for us all to collaborate, and it's a very exciting process for us going forward. I've got a couple of questions here, and Campbell's asked a question which I had in mind as well, and that's, hi Campbell, do you have any idea what the sickness might have been?
No.
And I guess my question was, do we have any sense of, presumably it was highly contagious, so I'm imagining that the Tiwi and others would have had absolutely no immunity to it, so I can't imagine what they might have left in their wake as they've sailed back to Batavia.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very curious about that. It must have been a virus, because the symptoms were quite similar for the whole crew by the sounds of it. And again, it's very unfortunate we don't have the original journals, because that would have absolutely helped. And yeah, I think that maybe exploring that with a medical professional to see what kind of diseases would those three symptoms, what boxes would that tick? And yeah, that would have certainly affected the Tiwi.
Absolutely.
Or the mainland groups that they would have interacted with.
Sure. Kathleen Neal's got a question, and she's also said a suggestion too, Lee. You need to watch the Time Team so you'll understand what geophys is. She's intrigued by the use of the term crusade in the 1705 instructions. What were the connotations of the term for the Dutch crusade? What was the connotations for that?
Yeah, it's a funny word in the sense that I have never seen it before. I mean, we use it in the Netherlands, but I haven't seen it in relation to expeditions or instructions to expeditions before. And I may have just missed that. So it certainly has that the Christian connotation to it. But then from reading the report or the letters that have survived, it doesn't come back. And I wonder whether it was just a word for exploration and nothing more. But it is an interesting one. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Carl has said a very interesting presentation. I think that exploration has always been part of the human interest in opportunity outside your own village or indeed country, today even into space. He's made a couple of comments there. Paul has got, we could assume that it was common that exploratory ships leaving the East Indies from the 17th century on would have had Indonesian crew. And I think, Paul, I think most of us would say yes, that certainly does seem Indonesian and Malay crew, I think is relatively common. And we have someone else just saying, Jarrah, I wonder, thank you very much. I wonder if you could elaborate on the lives of Aboriginal people brought to Java. At the moment, we don't have much, but there's always more to say. How much do the archives tell us about their lives in Indonesia? And has this been published elsewhere?
Little, so there's snippets, but that's something that certainly needs to be investigated, and especially in relation to whether that's the new 1705 New Guinea expedition, or even like 1623, Carstensen bringing people back.
And we certainly are looking at similar events in our project as well. Yes,
and
there's a lot to be said there, isn't there?
Yeah, and the women who escaped, where did they go? Did they stay there, or did they manage to make their way back home?
Exactly. And Heather has pointed out, Heather Dalton, hi Heather, it's that the Spanish use the term crusade all the time. So it may be someone who had perhaps a bit of Spanish influence there.
Could be, absolutely. Of course, the Dutch were less into converting people, although they still did it to some extent, right? Just think about the Mardekkers, or but yeah, the Spanish and the Portuguese were much more zealous in that, for sure.
Yeah,
and I can see there using that term. It's much more natural in when you put that within the scope of what they were doing.
Anne's just asked a quick question before I'll make this the last one. Is there evidence why someone was killed in Jansoon's expedition, and what happened to the body?
Yeah, good question. No idea what happened to the body, whether they would have taken that back on board or left it. I don't know. There too, we don't have journals of that expedition, so we just have correspondence that discusses it or mentions it, but then that's it. And the same thing, even with the copy journal of the 1623 Carstensen, we don't know what was left out, because again, it was a copy, it was not the original journal. And that's something that happens so often when you read material that's related to the explorations or journeys into Australia that we're just using secondary sources or things that have been rewritten.
I've just got one last question. I will ask it before I flick to my final slide. Anthony McLeod has said, a great talk. Did the Dutch pay any attention to the Treaty of Tordesillas line, aka the Western Australian border?
No, I don't think so. I think they did everything to get around Portuguese territory and making their own way and mark on particular regions. And with that, of course, I totally agree with whoever wrote that review of Fitzsimmons's book, that, the touching of Dutch explorers on the Australian coastline didn't really do much for Australia today, right? They're very ephemeral incidents coming back and forward. And they didn't do anything for Australian colonial history. And very little in very long term. We're talking here about substantial culture contact, but long-term culture contact.
Well, hopefully we will rewrite Australian history over the next few years. That's the plan. Just a tiny little plan I've got. So, that brings us to the end of a really fascinating talk. And thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you, Lee. Our next talk will be on the 14th of October, when we have Dr. Drew Pettifer from RMIT, who is an artist and does some extraordinarily beautiful work. He's going to be talking about a sorrowful act, the wreck of the Zeewick, and a project that he's been doing, which is about artistic installations on that particular wreck. He'll be in discussion with Miles Russell Cook. Miles is from the National Gallery of Victoria, and he's an art curator. On the 11th of November, we've got Greg Learman talking about a Palawa encounter with a French chaloupe with Professor Brian Martin, who will be in conversation with him. And don't forget the 6th to the 8th of December, our first ever Global Encounters Symposium. Our registration will be opening soon, and you can see we've got some fantastic, it is of course online and by Zoom. We're definitely containing it to a very short number of hours each day. I think it's 3. And we're focusing on Pacific Ocean first day, Southeast Asia, and then the Indian Ocean with some great speakers who you can see there. So that just leaves me to say thank you everyone for coming. Please keep an eye out for our next seminars and for other activity around the Global Encounters project. And good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much.